The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. For most people, mornings here were peaceful. Joggers strolled by with earbuds in, sprinklers clicked on across manicured lawns, and kids in backpacks waited for school buses. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong, where rules and order were prized above all else. For Daniel Harper, though, this morning was anything but peaceful. He opened his mailbox and pulled out a thick envelope stamped in bold red letters, "Notice of Fines." His stomach dropped. He had dealt with the HOA before, the constant reminders about his hedges being 2 inches too tall, or his garbage cans being visible for a single day after pickup. But this envelope felt heavier, more official, more dangerous. Daniel tore it open at the kitchen counter, his hands trembling. His eyes scanned the first line and he froze. Total balance due, $250,000. The words stared back at him like a cruel joke. $250,000. Not a few hundred, not even a few thousand, but a sum greater than the value of his house. The letter accused him of repeated land violations, listing infractions he had never even heard of. Things like unauthorized use of property easements and encroachment of non-permitted structures. His wife, Melissa, walked in just as Daniel sank into a chair. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing his pale face. He silently handed her the letter. She read it once, then again, her brow furrowing deeper with each line. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. But the HOA rarely admitted mistakes. Daniel thought back to every small interaction he'd ever had with them. The president of the HOA, Mr. Riggs, was notorious for his stern personality and zero-tolerance enforcement of rules. Daniel remembered how Riggs once fined a neighbor $500 for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue. Another family had nearly lost their home after accumulating fines for leaving a trailer in their driveway for one weekend too long. Still, Daniel had never imagined something this outrageous could happen to him. The letter went on to state that if the fines were not paid within 60 days, the HOA would pursue a lien against his property, potentially forcing foreclosure. He felt his pulse race, his chest tighten. They were threatening to take away his home, the place where his children had grown up, the place he and Melissa had poured their savings and sweat into. He tried to calm himself. "This has to be a clerical error," he muttered. "They'll fix it once I call." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The HOA didn't back down. They thrived on intimidation. Later that afternoon, Daniel called the HOA office. The receptionist's voice was flat, rehearsed. "All fines are final. If you wish to appeal, you may do so in writing within 30 days. Otherwise, payment is due in full." When he asked for specifics about the violations, she simply repeated the same line, offering no real explanation. That night, Daniel sat at the dining room table surrounded by stacks of papers. He pulled out every HOA notice he had received in the past 5 years. Most were small, annoying reminders. None explained how they could justify a $250,000 penalty. His frustration simmered into anger. Melissa reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "We'll figure this out. We can't just give in. There has to be something they're not telling us." But Daniel knew the HOA wasn't just an annoying neighborhood committee. They had legal power, lawyers, and a reputation for crushing anyone who opposed them. He could already hear neighbors whispering. No one had ever won against the HOA before. People who tried often lost their homes, their savings, their peace of mind. As Daniel stared again at the massive number printed on the notice, a thought took root in his mind. What if this wasn't just a mistake? What if it was deliberate? What if the HOA was targeting him for reasons he didn't yet understand? The idea unsettled him, but it also gave him a sense of resolve. He wasn't going to roll over and let them take everything he'd worked for. He needed answers. He needed to know why they believed he owed them this impossible sum. And most of all, he needed to know the truth about his land. Daniel didn't realize it yet. But the envelope that had arrived in his mailbox that morning wasn't just a threat. It was the beginning of a battle that would turn his life upside down, a battle that would reveal secrets hidden for decades, a battle that would prove that sometimes the real power doesn't lie with those who shout the loudest, but with those who dare to look closer. As he folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, Daniel whispered to himself. They picked the wrong person this time. The following week was a blur of phone calls, emails, and sleepless nights. Daniel tried to reason with the HOA office, but every attempt left him more frustrated than before. They never provided clear documentation, never answered his specific questions, and always ended with the same cold message. Payment is due. Failure to comply will result in legal action. It wasn't just the fines anymore. It was the way they spoke to him, as if he were some reckless trespasser rather than a homeowner who had lived here for over a decade. The language in their letters was sharp, threatening, and designed to make him feel small. On Wednesday evening, Daniel was summoned to a board meeting. He arrived at the neighborhood clubhouse, a small brick building decorated with framed photographs of past HOA presidents. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table where the board sat like judges. At the center was Mr. Riggs, the HOA president, his gray suit pressed and his expression stern. Daniel's palms were sweaty as he stepped to the microphone. I received a notice claiming I owe $250,000 in fines, he began, his voice steady but firm. That's absurd. I want to know exactly what violations I've supposedly committed. Riggs leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Mr. Harper, the violations are numerous and ongoing. Unauthorized landscaping changes, encroachment into community land, and non-compliance with easement restrictions. We've documented everything. The fines are calculated according to the HOA bylaws, Daniel shook his head. That's impossible. I haven't built anything new. I haven't expanded my property. You can't just invent violations. The board members exchanged smug glances, and one of them, Mrs. Caldwell, spoke up. With all due respect, Mr. Harper, you signed the covenant agreement when you bought your home. You agreed to abide by the rules. If you violated those rules, there are consequences. Her tone was calm, almost condescending, the way a teacher might speak to a misbehaving student. Daniel's frustration boiled inside him. Consequences? You're talking about $250,000. That's not a consequence. That's theft. A murmur spread through the audience of homeowners seated behind him. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered to one another. Daniel could feel the weight of their judgment. Few people were brave enough to challenge the HOA openly. Everyone knew the board had power, and those who defied them often ended up losing. Riggs tapped a gavel against the table, silencing the room. The fines are non-negotiable. If you fail to pay, the HOA will pursue a lien against your property. That is our final word. Daniel left the meeting fuming. Outside, a few neighbors caught up to him. One of them, an older man named Frank, leaned in and whispered, "Careful, son. Nobody wins against the HOA. The best thing you can do is pay and move on." Daniel's jaw tightened. $250,000 isn't something I can just pay. Frank gave him a sympathetic look. I know, but I've seen what happens when people fight back. They'll bury you in legal fees. They'll make your life miserable. That night, Daniel sat on his porch, staring at the neighborhood he had once been proud to call home. The freshly cut lawns, the neatly painted houses, the quiet streets, they suddenly felt oppressive. Behind the order and beauty lurked fear. Fear of the board, fear of stepping out of line, fear of losing everything. Melissa joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. What did they say? They said pay up or lose the house, Daniel replied bitterly. They think they can bully us into submission. Melissa sighed, her eyes scanning the quiet street. They've been doing this to everyone for years, haven't they? Daniel nodded. Yeah, and nobody fights back because they're scared. A silence hung between them, heavy and unspoken. The HOA thrived on that silence. They operated like an untouchable authority, confident that no homeowner would dare stand up to them. But Daniel wasn't built to accept injustice. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He began spending late nights at his desk, combing through the HOA's bylaws, county zoning laws, and every scrap of paperwork he could find. He highlighted contradictions, noted vague language, and searched for loopholes. One evening, as Melissa walked by, she noticed the growing stack of documents on the table. Are you sure you want to go down this road? She asked gently. Frank's right. They could drag us into court for years. It could cost more than the fines themselves. Daniel looked up from the papers, his eyes sharp with resolve. I can't let them win. If they get away with this, they'll do it to someone else. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll keep abusing their power. Someone has to stop them. Melissa studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then we'll fight. Together. Her words gave Daniel strength, but he also knew the road ahead would be long and brutal. The HOA had money, lawyers, and a stranglehold on the community. He had little more than his determination and a growing sense that something about their claims didn't add up, because deep down, in the quiet hours of the night, Daniel felt there was more to this story. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were hiding something, and he was going to find out what it was. The next few days were consumed by a rhythm of frustration and restless determination. Daniel worked his regular job by day, but every evening he sat hunched over the dining room table, combing through old files and HOA documents until long past midnight. The flickering desk lamp became his constant companion, and the stacks of folders seemed to grow taller with each passing night. Most of the paperwork was familiar: tax records, utility bills, mortgage statements. But one night, as he dug through an old cardboard box labeled Home Purchase 2009, he found a thick manila envelope he hadn't touched in years. Inside was the original closing packet from when he and Melissa bought the house. Daniel flipped through page after page until he landed on a folded sheet of parchment-like paper. His heart skipped. It was the original deed. He hadn't seen it in over a decade. Curious, he spread it out on the table, smoothing the creases with his palms. At first, it looked like any other property deed, with the legal jargon and long strings of numbers. But then something caught his eye: the description of the property boundaries. The wording didn't just mention his lot number, it outlined coordinates that extended far beyond his small backyard. He grabbed a pen and paper, sketching the boundaries as written. The more he drew, the stranger it became. According to the deed, his property stretched across multiple streets, covering sections of the entire neighborhood. He blinked in disbelief. That couldn't be right. Surely it was a clerical error. But something about the precise coordinates made him pause. Melissa wandered in, rubbing her eyes. "You're still up?" "Look at this," Daniel said, pushing the deed toward her. "Does that seem bigger than just our yard?" Melissa leaned over the paper, frowning. "Wait, are you saying this deed says we own more than we thought?" Daniel tapped the map he had sketched. "That's what it looks like. A lot more. Maybe even the land the HOA claims belongs to them." For a moment, silence filled the room as the weight of the possibility settled in. Could it be true? Could he actually own more than just his house and yard? The next morning, Daniel took the deed to the county records office. The clerk, a bespectacled woman named Linda, pulled up the digital files on her computer while Daniel waited nervously. "Let's see," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Yes, this is your deed. Purchased in 2009, correct?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "But can you confirm the property boundaries, because they don't look like just one lot?" Linda clicked through several screens, then leaned back in her chair. "Well, that's interesting. According to this, your property includes parcels extending into what's now the subdivision common areas. Streets, green spaces, even the clubhouse." Daniel's heart pounded. "You mean all of that is technically mine?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Legally speaking, yes, at least on paper. Looks like there may have been a filing error when the subdivision was developed. The developers might have sold you more land than intended. And if that was never corrected, it's still yours." Daniel sat there stunned. For years, the HOA had treated him like a subject under their authority. But now he held evidence that suggested the entire neighborhood might actually rest on his deed. Back at home, Melissa listened in shock as Daniel explained what he had learned. "So you're telling me they've been finding us for violations on land that technically belongs to us?" Daniel nodded. "That's exactly what it looks like." Her jaw dropped. "No wonder they've been so aggressive. Maybe they know. Maybe they're hoping we never find out." The thought chilled Daniel. If the HOA already suspected the truth, their threats weren't just about enforcing rules. They might be an attempt to scare him into submission before he uncovered their mistake. That evening, Daniel called an attorney recommended by a coworker, a sharp-minded man named Alex Morton. They met at Alex's downtown office where Daniel laid the deed on the desk. Alex studied it carefully, flipping through the coordinates and comparing them to county maps on his computer. After a long pause, he leaned back and whistled softly. "Mr. Harper, this is a gold mine. If this deed holds up in court, you don't just own your house. You own practically the whole subdivision. The HOA has no authority over you because legally they've been governing land they don't own." Daniel felt both elated and overwhelmed. "So what does that mean for us?" Alex folded his hands. "It means you have leverage. Tremendous leverage. But it also means the HOA will fight you tooth and nail. If they realize you know this, they'll stop at nothing to protect their position. This could get ugly." For a moment, Daniel imagined the possibilities. What if he could finally stand up to the HOA? What if he could expose their abuse of power and free his neighbors from years of intimidation? But the excitement was tempered by a gnawing fear. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. This was about control, power, and an entire community's way of life. As he drove home that night, Daniel replayed Alex's words in his mind. "You have leverage." For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt like the balance of power might finally be shifting in his favor. Still, he knew one thing for certain. Once the HOA discovered he had this information, they would come after him harder than ever before. And that was exactly what he was counting on. The following week, Daniel felt as if he were living two separate lives. To his co-workers and neighbors, nothing had changed. He still waved politely at people driving by, still showed up to work on time, still mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings. But behind closed doors, his life had become consumed by a single mission, proving once and for all that the land in question was his. Every night, he sat across from Alex Morton, the attorney, in a cluttered office lined with shelves of law books. Together they pored over maps, deeds, and county filings. The deeper they dug, the clearer the truth became. The HOA's authority was built on shaky ground. Alex tapped a highlighted section of the deed one evening. Here it is again. "Your property lines don't just include your lot. They run through the common areas, past the streets, and into parcels that the HOA claims as theirs. And since there's no record of a transfer or correction, it all still belongs to you." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "So for all these years they've been fining me for violating rules on land I actually own?" "Exactly," Alex said. "If this were challenged in court, they wouldn't just lose their claim over your property. They could lose control of the entire neighborhood." The weight of those words settled on Daniel like a stone. This wasn't just about his family anymore. This was about every person in the subdivision who had been bullied and fined by the HOA. The late-night notices, the threats, the fear. If the deed held up, all of it had been for nothing. But Alex was careful not to let Daniel get ahead of himself. "Listen," he cautioned, "this doesn't mean it will be easy. HOAs are relentless. They have lawyers, resources, and a reputation for intimidation. If we confront them, they'll deny everything at first. They'll stall, they'll threaten, and they'll try to discredit you. We need airtight evidence and a clear strategy." Daniel nodded. "So what's the next step?" "First," Alex said, "we'll get an official surveyor to confirm the boundaries. That way, we're not just relying on the deed. We'll have a modern professional map showing exactly what's yours. Then we'll quietly gather all the HOA's bylaws and records. We'll compare their claims to what you legally own. Once we've built a strong case, we can decide whether to confront them directly or take it to court." The plan made sense, but it also filled Daniel with dread. He knew that the moment he revealed what he had, the HOA would strike back. The board thrived on control, and if their foundation was threatened, they wouldn't just roll over. Within days, a surveyor walked the neighborhood with measuring tools and mapping equipment. Daniel followed him discreetly, watching as the man marked points along the sidewalks, curbs, and open spaces. When the surveyor returned with the results, Daniel's suspicions were confirmed. The deed wasn't lying. The boundaries of his land encompassed nearly everything: the clubhouse, the park, the playground, and even parts of the streets themselves. When Alex spread the survey map across the desk, Daniel's pulse quickened. "So it's real." "It's all mine," Alex gave a thin smile. "Real, yes, but complicated. The HOA won't go quietly. If you push this, you'll be turning the entire community upside down. That night, Daniel sat with Melissa at the kitchen table showing her the map. Her eyes widened as she traced the boundaries with her finger. "This changes everything," she whispered. Daniel leaned back, his voice low but firm. "It does, but it also puts a target on our backs. Once they know we have this, they'll come after us harder than ever." Melissa reached for his hand. "Then we'll be ready. They've pushed us into a corner for too long. Maybe it's time someone pushed back." Her words gave Daniel courage, but he couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety in his stomach. For years, the HOA had ruled through fear. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just strip them of their power, it would humiliate them. And people like Riggs, the HOA president, didn't handle humiliation well. Sure enough, within a week, Daniel received another letter. This one was even harsher than before. "Failure to pay your outstanding balance will result in immediate legal proceedings. The HOA reserves the right to seize your property through foreclosure if necessary." Daniel almost laughed when he read it. The bold threats, the arrogance, the certainty of their power, it was almost surreal, knowing what he now held in his hands. They were threatening to take property that legally belonged to him. He called Alex immediately. "They're doubling down. They're trying to scare me again." Alex's voice was calm, steady. "Let them. The stronger they push, the more foolish they'll look when we reveal the truth. But be careful. Don't let them suspect what we know yet." "Timing will be everything," Daniel agreed, though it wasn't easy to keep the secret. At neighborhood gatherings, he heard whispers about his dispute with the HOA. Some neighbors looked at him with pity, others with fear, as if standing too close to him might make them targets too. One mother at the playground quietly warned Melissa, "You should really just pay them. The board doesn't like to lose." Melissa forced a polite smile but said nothing. She and Daniel both knew the truth. And soon, so would everyone else. For now, though, Daniel kept his head down and his evidence close. The deed and surveyor's report were locked in Alex's office, safe from tampering. The plan was simple. Wait until the HOA pushed him to the brink, then unveil the truth in front of everyone. But Daniel also knew that the longer he waited, the more dangerous the game became. The HOA was tightening its grip, and every move felt like a test of wills. The evidence was clear. The law was on his side, but the battle for power had only just begun. By the time the next HOA board meeting rolled around, Daniel was ready. Weeks of preparation had hardened his resolve. The deed, the surveyor's report, and the legal interpretation sat neatly organized in Alex's office, copies made and ready for use. Daniel knew the time had come to face the board directly. The neighborhood clubhouse was packed that evening. Word had spread quickly that Daniel's battle with the HOA was escalating, and curious homeowners filled every seat. Some came out of solidarity, others out of fear, and a few simply because they loved the spectacle of conflict. Either way, the air buzzed with anticipation. At the head of the room, the board sat in its usual formation. Mr. Riggs, the HOA president, wore his trademark scowl, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. To his right sat Mrs. Caldwell, her lips pursed in thin disapproval, and beside her, the other board members shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. Daniel walked to the microphone when his name was called, his heart pounding but his steps steady. He carried only a small folder in his hand, not revealing the bulk of what he had discovered. Riggs adjusted his tie and leaned forward. "Mr. Harper," he said coldly, "you have been summoned to address your unpaid balance. You currently owe this association $250,000. We expect payment or a clear plan of action tonight. Failure to comply will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniel raised his chin. "I'm here to tell you that I don't owe you a dime. And I'll explain why." Riggs slammed his gavel against the table. "You are out of order. This is not the time to debate facts. The fines are final." Daniel's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. "The facts are exactly what we're here to discuss. You've accused me of violations on land that isn't even yours to regulate?" The room fell into uneasy silence. Riggs's face tightened. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying," Daniel said, pulling a paper from his folder. "I have the deed to my property, and according to this deed, my boundaries extend far beyond my backyard. In fact, They cover large portions of this neighborhood, including areas the HOA claims to control. A stunned hush swept over the audience. Mrs. Caldwell leaned forward, her voice sharp. That's preposterous. The association has governed this community for years. Are you suggesting we don't even own the land we maintain? Daniel met her gaze without flinching. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. And I have proof. A licensed surveyor confirmed it. My attorney has reviewed it. The county records support it. You've been fining me for so-called violations on land that doesn't even belong to you. For the first time, Riggs's composure cracked. His face reddened as he leaned toward the microphone. This is a stunt. You're twisting paperwork to avoid responsibility. The association won't be bullied. But it was Riggs's voice that trembled now, not Daniel's. From the back of the room, a homeowner spoke up nervously. Wait, if what he's saying is true, does that mean the HOA has been enforcing rules without legal authority? Another voice chimed in, louder this time. Does that mean all our fines were fake? Panic spread like a spark catching dry grass. People turned to one another, whispering urgently. Years of resentment bubbled to the surface, fueled by the possibility that the board's power had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. Riggs pounded the gavel again, but the noise of the crowd drowned him out. Order! This meeting is under the control of the HOA board. Anyone spreading lies will be subject to penalties. Daniel raised his hand, and the room quieted enough for him to speak. I'm not here to cause chaos. I'm here to tell the truth. The HOA has built its authority on land it doesn't own. That means these fines are not just unfair, they're illegitimate. And if you push this to court, the entire structure of your so-called authority will collapse. Mrs. Caldwell shook her head furiously. This is outrageous. You'll destroy this community with your lies. Daniel's voice softened, steady but powerful. No, I'll free it. How many of you have lived in fear of fines? How many of you have paid thousands just to avoid losing your homes? This isn't how a neighborhood should feel. We should be a community, not subjects of a board that rules through intimidation. The room erupted again, this time with cheers from some and angry protests from others. A dividing line was being drawn, those who clung to the HOA for structure and those who saw it now as a sham. Riggs leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. You don't know who you're dealing with, Mr. Harper. We have the best lawyers money can buy. If you go through with this, we'll bury you in court. Daniel met his glare head on. Then I guess I'll see you there. The meeting ended in chaos. Homeowners spilling into the night, arguing, debating, some rushing to Daniel with questions, while others avoided him altogether. But one thing was certain. The seed of doubt had been planted. The board's aura of invincibility had cracked, and the truth was beginning to leak through. As Daniel walked back to his car, Melissa by his side, he felt the weight of what had just happened. He had turned the tables, but the real fight was only just beginning. Melissa slipped her hand into his. They looked scared, she whispered. Daniel nodded, staring back at the clubhouse where Riggs still stood fuming inside. Good, because they should be. The days after the explosive board meeting felt like the calm before a storm. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Some residents stopped Daniel on his evening walks, whispering questions and encouragement. Others avoided him altogether, afraid to be seen siding with the man who had challenged the all-powerful HOA. Melissa noticed the shift, too. People are talking, she said one morning over coffee. Half the neighbors seem ready to storm the gates with us, and the other half look at us like we've cursed the community. Daniel shrugged. That means we hit a nerve. The truth has a way of shaking people, but behind the scenes the HOA was scrambling. Riggs and the board sent out an urgent notice. A mandatory community-wide meeting would be held in the clubhouse to address ongoing misinformation and preserve the integrity of the association. The language was cold and defensive, but Daniel knew what it really meant. They were cornered. On the night of the meeting, the clubhouse was overflowing. Chairs filled quickly and latecomers lined the walls. The air was thick with tension, as if everyone sensed that this gathering would decide the future of their neighborhood. Riggs began the meeting with his usual booming authority. Ladies and gentlemen, the HOA has recently been subjected to outrageous claims that threaten the stability of our community. We want to assure you these claims are false. Our authority is established, our rules are legal, and no individual can override the covenant you all signed when purchasing your homes." Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded in agreement, but others crossed their arms skeptically. The seeds of doubt Daniel had planted were growing. When Riggs finished, Daniel stood. He didn't wait for permission. He simply walked to the front of the room, holding a large envelope in his hands. "I don't want to fight with anyone here," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the room. "I just want the truth out in the open. Because for too long, this community has lived under fear. Fear of fines, fear of losing homes, fear of stepping out of line. But fear only works if you believe the people holding the power actually have the right to do so." He laid the deed on the table. "This is my property deed. It shows that the land this HOA claims to control, the clubhouse, the common areas, even parts of the streets, legally falls under my ownership. I had a professional surveyor confirm it. My attorney verified it. And the county clerk validated it." He held up the survey map, bold black lines stretching across the subdivision. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people leaned forward to see. "This isn't a rumor," Daniel continued. "This is a fact. The HOA has been operating without legal authority over this land. Every fine, every threat, every foreclosure attempt, it all rests on something they don't even own." A woman in the crowd raised her hand. "So, are you saying all the fines I've paid over the years weren't even valid?" Daniel nodded solemnly. "That's exactly what I'm saying," shouts broke out across the room. Some people were furious at the board, demanding answers. Others clung to the comfort of the HOA, insisting there had to be a mistake. But for the first time, the board wasn't in control of the room. The homeowners were. Riggs slammed his gavel repeatedly, his face red with fury. "This is nonsense. These so-called documents are irrelevant. The HOA's power comes from the covenant everyone signed, not from one man's twisted interpretation of land records." Alex Morton, who had accompanied Daniel that night, finally spoke up. "Actually, that's not true. Covenants cannot override property ownership. If the association doesn't legally own or govern the land, its rules hold no weight. And based on this deed and survey, Mr. Harper's ownership supersedes any claims made by the HOA." The room erupted again, louder this time. People shouted at the board, demanding accountability. Others pressed forward to see the deed for themselves. The board members exchanged nervous glances, their authority crumbling before their eyes. Daniel raised his voice above the chaos. "I'm not here to dismantle the community. I'm here to give us back what we should have had all along: freedom. No more fear. No more intimidation. If the board wants to fight this in court, I'm ready. But I'm offering them a choice right now. Step down voluntarily, end these bogus fines, and let us build a neighborhood that's run by cooperation, not control." For the first time, Riggs looked uncertain. His hands gripped the gavel tightly, but his voice faltered. "You'll regret this. You're tearing apart everything we've built." "No," Daniel said calmly. "I'm tearing apart an illusion. What you built was control, not community. And it ends tonight." The crowd cheered, drowning out the board's protests. Homeowners began shouting their support, some even calling for an immediate vote to dissolve the HOA. Riggs tried to regain order, but his words were swallowed by the momentum of the people. By the end of the night, the balance of power had shifted completely. For the first time in years, the board no longer held the neighborhood in its grip. The homeowners had tasted the truth, and there was no going back. As Daniel and Melissa walked home, neighbors stopped to thank them, some with tears in their eyes. "You gave us hope," one elderly woman whispered, clutching Daniel's hand. Melissa smiled as they reached their front door. "You did it," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "We're not done yet. They'll try to fight back in court, maybe behind closed doors. But at least now the people know the truth. And that changes everything." For the first time since the nightmare began, Daniel felt something he hadn't in months. Not fear, not anger, but relief. The tables had turned, and the HOA was no longer untouchable. The days following the explosive community meeting felt like a new dawn for the neighborhood. For years, the homeowners had lived under the shadow of strict rules and intimidating letters. But now, that shadow had begun to lift. The HOA board, once feared and untouchable, found itself on shaky ground. Riggs tried to push back with threats of lawsuits, claiming Daniel's discovery was fraudulent, but the momentum of the community had already shifted. Alex Morton filed the official paperwork in county court, attaching Daniel's deed, the survey results, and an affidavit from the clerk who confirmed the land ownership. The legal case was airtight, and word spread quickly that the HOA had very little chance of winning. Within 2 weeks, Riggs resigned as president. A few board members followed, their resignations delivered quietly and without ceremony. Those who remained tried to hold meetings, but attendance dwindled, and their authority evaporated. For the first time in years, neighbors began reclaiming their lives. Families planted gardens without fear of fines. Children rode bikes freely, no longer restricted by arbitrary rules about where they could and couldn't play. Homeowners painted their shutters, built tree houses, and even hosted block parties in defiance of rules that no longer mattered. Daniel and Melissa watched it all unfold from their front porch, cups of coffee warming their hands. Melissa smiled as she saw kids laughing on the sidewalks. "It feels alive again," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "This is what a neighborhood is supposed to be. Not a prison with rules, but a place where people look out for each other." But the victory wasn't just about freedom from fines or intimidation. It was about something deeper, the restoration of dignity. The homeowners had been reminded that they were more than signatures on a covenant. They were people with voices, rights, and the power to stand up when things weren't fair. Weeks later, a community gathering was held, not under the HOA's banner, but organized by the residents themselves. This time, there was no gavel, no rigid agenda, no fear. Instead, picnic tables lined the park, food was shared, and neighbors laughed together. Daniel was hesitant at first to attend, worried that some might resent the upheaval he had caused. But when he and Melissa arrived, they were greeted with cheers and applause. Children ran up to hug them, and older neighbors shook Daniel's hand firmly, thanking him for giving them their neighborhood back. One man, a retired veteran named Carl, stood before the group and raised a toast. To Daniel and Melissa Harper, who reminded us that freedom doesn't come from being told what to do. It comes from standing up when you know something is wrong. The crowd erupted into applause, and Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had never wanted to be a hero, but somehow that's what he had become. Later that evening, as the sun set and lanterns lit the park, Melissa leaned against him and whispered, "So what happens now?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Now we decide what kind of community we want to build. Not one run by fear, but one run by trust. The HOA might try to drag this through the courts, but even if they do, we've already won in the ways that matter." And he was right. Months later, the court officially dismissed the HOA's claims, confirming that the deed made Daniel the legal owner of the disputed land. Without authority or legitimacy, the association dissolved entirely. The victory wasn't just Daniel's. It belonged to every homeowner who had lived in silence, afraid to speak up. They were no longer afraid. Daniel sometimes wondered if the fight had been worth the sleepless nights, the threats, and the stress. But each time he looked around at the thriving, free neighborhood, he knew the answer. It had been worth every moment. Standing at his front door one quiet evening, Daniel watched as kids chased fireflies down the street, their laughter echoing through the warm night air. For the first time since moving in, he felt at peace in his own home. He turned to Melissa with a small smile. "You know what the craziest part is?" "What?" she asked. "This all started because they tried to fine us. If they hadn't pushed so hard, I might never have looked at that deed again. Their greed exposed their weakness," Melissa chuckled. "Poetic justice." Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his voice steady and thoughtful. "It just goes to show, sometimes the people who think they hold all the power are standing on paper-thin ground. All it takes is one person willing to read the fine print to bring the truth to light." He paused, watching the glow of porch lights flicker on across the street. "The real question is, how many other people are living under the same kind of control, never realizing they have the power to change it?" And with that question hanging in the air, Daniel knew their story wasn't just about one neighborhood. It was a reminder for anyone who had ever felt powerless that sometimes the key to freedom was already in their hands, waiting to be discovered.